Okay, let's dive straight into something that's probably crossed your mind at some point. You decide to, I don't know, wave hello or reach for your phone. It feels like a simple act, right? But have you ever paused to consider the sheer strangeness of it?
How so?
Well, a thought, this immaterial thing floating around in your head, somehow triggers your physical body, this collection of cells and muscles, to move. It's a real head scratcher. How do these two fundamentally different things connect?
That very puzzle, yeah, they captivated thinkers for centuries, and it's the focus of our deep dive today. We're journeying back to the 17th century to explore the revolutionary and, well, still debated, ideas of René Descartes.
Ah, Descartes.
Yeah, drawing from our source text on his mind-body distinction.
Yeah.
Think of Descartes as someone who really dug into the nuts and bolts of what it means to be human.
Exactly. And for you, the listener, this isn't just some dusty philosophical relic. Descartes' ideas about the mind and body are foundational. They've shaped how we understand consciousness, the relationship between our brains and our thoughts, even how we see ourselves.
Yeah. Right.
By the end of this, you'll hopefully have a much clearer understanding of a concept that, continues to resonate in modern discussions. Descartes essentially created a philosophical Rubik's Cube, didn't he? Two distinct sides that seemingly shouldn't connect, but somehow do.
That's a good way to put it. At the core of Descartes' contribution is his theory of mind-body dualism. He argued that the mind and the body aren't just different aspects of the same thing, but fundamentally different substances.
Different substances?
Yeah. He proposed that the mind is a thinking, non-physical entity. It's all about thoughts, beliefs, desires, and it doesn't take up space. The body, on the other hand, is a physical substance. It has size and shape, but it lacks the capacity for thought.
Okay.
And crucially, Descartes argued that one of these could exist without the other.
Which immediately throws up a huge question mark, doesn't it? Here's where it gets really interesting. If the mind and body are these two completely separate entities with totally different natures, how on earth do they interact? How does my non-physical desire for that morning coffee translate into my physical arm reaching out?
That's the central tension, absolutely. The thing we're going to unpack.
Yeah.
Precisely. And throughout this deep dive, we'll trace Descartes' own exploration of this very issue. We'll begin by examining his reasons for proposing this radical split between mind and body.
Okay.
Then we'll delve into the arguments he used to support his perspective. This will naturally lead us to the infamous mind-body problem, the exact question you just raised about interaction.
Right.
And finally, we'll consider Descartes' own proposed solution, which involves this concept of a union between the mind and body.
Yeah.
You'll get, hopefully, a comprehensive view of his thought process and the enduring challenges it presents.
So let's start with the why. Why did Descartes insist on this real distinction? It wasn't just a purely abstract philosophical exercise, was it? What drove him to separate mind and body so definitively?
Not at all. According to our source, Descartes had two main motivations. One rooted in his religious beliefs, and the other in his scientific aspirations.
Okay, two big ones.
Let's tackle the religious side first. Descartes was concerned about individuals he called irreligious people, who, he felt, placed their sole trust in mathematics and wouldn't accept the immortality of the soul without a similarly rigorous, almost mathematical proof.
Right. He wanted to provide a rational basis, sort of a logical argument, for the idea that our souls continue after our physical bodies cease to function.
Exactly.
So this real distinction, demonstrating that the mind is separate and distinct from the physical body, was a crucial step in building an argument for the soul's potential to survive death.
That was the idea. He believed that if he could demonstrate that the mind is a distinct entity, independent of the body, then these irreligious people might be persuaded to believe in an afterlife.
And therefore behave morally.
And consequently, believe in the importance of moral behavior, expecting rewards and punishments beyond this earthly existence. However, it's vital to note, as the text clarifies, that Descartes only argued for the possibility of the mind existing without the body.
Ah, okay. Not a guarantee of immortality, then.
No, he didn't immediately conclude that it does achieve immortality. He recognized that further arguments involving his understanding of physics and, crucially, God's will would be necessary to fully establish that.
Okay, so the real distinction was like laying a philosophical foundation, showing that the survival of the soul was rationally defensible, not just pure faith.
Precisely.
That makes sense. Now let's switch gears to his scientific motivations. How did separating mind and body help his science?
Well, beyond the spiritual, Descartes had very practical scientific reasons for wanting this clear separation.
Right. Let's explore how this impacted his groundbreaking approach to understanding the physical world.
This is equally compelling. Descartes was deeply committed to replacing the then-dominant Aristotelian physics with a new mechanistic understanding of the natural world, based purely on geometry and motion.
Aristotelian physics. That involved final causes, didn't it?
Yes, exactly. The Aristotelian view relied heavily on the concept of final causes, the idea that everything in nature behaves in pursuit of some ultimate purpose or goal, like a seed having an inbuilt drive to become a plant.
Right. The idea of a stone falling because its goal is to be at the center of the earth, that always felt a bit off, like giving intentions to rocks.
Precisely. Descartes strongly critiqued this, especially the role of what were called substantial forms. These were seen as the underlying organizing principles within things, explaining why matter was structured a certain way and had certain tendencies.
So, like, the form of fire explains why it rises.
Kind of, yeah. And this framework even extended to non-living things. Descartes had a big problem with attributing these inherent aims or purposes to everything, even inanimate objects.
How could a rock know where the Earth's center is?
Exactly his point. He argued, as our source quotes from his 6 replies, that explaining gravity by saying bodies move towards the center of the Earth as if they had knowledge of that center seemed absurd.
Because only minds have knowledge.
Right. So attributing mental properties like knowledge or intentions to non-mental things like rocks was, in his view, of fundamental confusion, a category error.
So the real distinction clearly separating the thinking mind from the non-thinking body was his way to clean house. To get rid of these mentalistic explanations in physics.
You got it. It paved the way for a purely physical, geometrical understanding of how bodies move and interact, based on size, shape, motion. No goals needed.
A pivotal step for mechanistic philosophy.
Absolutely. A radical departure from the Aristotelian worldview.
Okay, so we understand the two main forces driving Descartes, the religious angle and the scientific one. Now let's get into how he actually tried to argue for this real distinction. Our source points to 2 key versions, both in his 6th meditation. Let's start with the first one.
Okay, but before we dive into the arguments themselves, it's crucial to grasp what Descartes meant by real distinction.
Right, the technical term.
Yeah, in his philosophical language, it means that 2 substances, things capable of existing independently, with God's help, are distinct. This is different from modes, which are just qualities, like the shape of a thing, that can't exist on their own.
So mind and body could exist separately, even if they don't in our experience. That's the claim.
That's the claim. So the first version of the argument hinges on his famous concept of clear and distinct ideas.
Ah, yes. How does that work?
Well, Descartes argues, essentially, I have a clear and distinct idea of myself purely as a thinking, non-extended thing that's the mind.
Where?
And at the same time, I have a clear and distinct idea of the body as purely an extended non-thinking thing.
Got it.
Therefore, he concludes, I am really distinct from my body and could exist without it. The core idea is trusting the clarity of his own conception.
It sounds almost too simple. Like, I think it clear, so it must be true. What justifies that leap?
Yeah, you're right to question it. This is where his doctrine of clear and distinct ideas and their supposed guarantee of truth comes in. For Descartes, a clear idea is vivid, present to the mind. A distinct idea is precise, separate from other ideas.
Okay.
He argues that if he has this kind of super clear understanding of mind and body, having these mutually exclusive properties, one thinking non-extended, the other extended non-thinking, then they must actually be distinct.
And the guarantee for this, that's where God comes in, right? The non-deceiving God.
Exactly. In his 4th meditation, he argues that a perfect God wouldn't create us in such a way that we're systematically deceived about things we perceive with utmost clarity and distinctness.
So if I clearly and distinctly perceive mind and body as separate, God wouldn't let me be wrong about that.
That's the logic.
Huh.
If God allowed such fundamental errors in our clearest thoughts, he'd be a deceiver, which contradicts his perfect nature. So clear and distinct perceptions must be true.
Okay, accepting the God argument for a moment. It supports the distinction. But the source raises a big counterpoint, doesn't it? Can we really conceive of minds without brains?
It does. It's a major challenge.
Yeah.
While we easily see bodies without minds, rocks, tables, we have zero experience of minds floating around without bodies or brains.
So the whole argument hinges on just how reliable Descartes' clear and distinct perception of the mind as purely non-physical actually is.
Precisely. If it turns out the mind is somehow fundamentally tied to the physical brain, even if we don't fully understand how, then his initial premise, the clear idea of a non-extended mind, might be flawed.
It feels a bit circular. His framework makes it work, but if you doubt the framework...
Well, yes. Within his system, the clear and distinct understanding plus God's power to make things possible makes a separate existence metaphysically possible, hence they are really distinct substances. But step outside that.
And the certainty wavers. Okay, what about the second argument, the one about divisibility?
Right, this one shifts focus. Also in the sixth meditation, it looks at what he saw as essential properties, divisibility.
How does that work?
Descartes argues that the body, by its very nature as something extended in space, is always divisible. You can always imagine breaking into smaller parts, right?
Yeah, makes sense. Cut anything physical in half.
But the mind, he claims, is fundamentally indivisible. When he introspects, looks at his own mind, his I, he doesn't find any parts. He experiences himself as a single, unified whole.
The idea being, if you could divide a mind, you'd get multiple selves, which seems absurd. My consciousness feels like one thing.
Exactly. If you split your mind, are there two uses? Seems contradictory. Bodies, though, easily divided. He argues this fundamental difference, divisible body, indivisible mind, proves they're completely different kinds of things.
Because something can't be both divisible and indivisible at the same time. Its nature has one or the other.
Right. A nature can't simultaneously have and not have parts.
This argument feels a bit more direct. It doesn't lean so heavily on the whole clear and distinct ideas and God thing.
That's true. It focuses more on the perceived essential natures. However, it still faces challenges. The main one, as our source notes, is, has he really proven the mind isn't physical?
Like maybe the mind is the brain or dependent on it, and the brain is divisible.
Exactly. If the thinking thing is tied to the physical divisible brain, then maybe our subjective feeling of the mind's unity is just, well, how it feels, not its fundamental metaphysical nature. The brain supporting that feeling certainly has parts.
So even with this divisibility argument, the possibility of a physical basis for mind hangs around.
It does. These are powerful arguments, hugely influential, but not watertight. And this very distinction, this mind-body split he argued for, well, that leads straight into the big problem.
The mind-body problem, yeah, the elephant in the philosophical room. If they're so different, how do they talk to each other? How does my non-physical mind make my physical hand pick up this mug?
That's it, exactly. How can a non-physical, non-extended mind cause a physical, extended body to move? Voluntary action. And the other way, how can physical events in the body, like light hitting my retina, cause non-physical sensations or thoughts in my mind? Sensory perception.
Our source mentions Gassendi and Princess Elizabeth really pressing him on this.
They did. Gassendi, Elizabeth, sharp thinkers. They hammered on the interaction issue. How does something without extension push something with extension? Seems like you need contact, like billiard balls.
Yeah, how can a ghost push a cannonball?
Right. And Elizabeth also asked, how can the body affect the mind? How does stubbing my toe physically result in the mental feeling of pain? Where is the connection point between physical nerves and non-physical feeling?
It seems like a fundamental mismatch. Physical causes, physical effects, we get that, but non-physical causing physical, or vice versa. It feels mysterious.
It does. And if interaction is impossible, Descartes' whole system is in trouble, isn't it? Our basic experience of deciding and acting, seeing and feeling seems undermined. It would also challenge his claim to clearly understand the mind, if that understanding leads to this paradox.
So how did Descartes respond? Did he just ignore it?
Oh, no, he definitely engaged with it. Interestingly, he didn't seem to think it was as devastating a problem as his critics did.
Really?
Yeah. His initial reaction, particularly to Gassendi, was sort of like, hold on, you're jumping ahead. You're asking how they interact before we've properly understood the union between mind and body.
Okay.
And he also suggested the critics were working on a flawed assumption, the idea that things with totally different natures can't interact. He questioned whether that was actually proven.
So part one, we haven't fully explained the union yet. Part two, maybe different things can interact, just not like billiard balls.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Regarding the second part, remember his causal principles from the third meditation about the less real not causing the more real?
Vaguely, yeah. Used for his God proofs.
Right. Well, that was about existence. You could maybe stretch it to say mind and body are both finite substances, so maybe interaction isn't about one creating the other, but affecting its modes or states in a way that doesn't require identical natures. He hinted at a non-mechanistic causality.
Okay, so not like physical pushing, but what about this union? That sounds key. How did he explain that?
This is where things get really interpretive, and scholars disagree. Our source highlights a view championed by thinkers like Marlene Roseman, suggesting Descartes actually leaned towards something like the old Scholastic-Aristotelian form matter theory for the union.
Wait, form matter? Like Aristotle?
Well,
But wasn't Descartes trying to overthrow Aristotelian physics? That sounds contradictory.
it does seem paradoxical. And the traditional view often just sees him stuck with two separate substances trying to interact mechanistically, which led successors like Malebranche or Leibniz to propose things like God constantly intervening or rejecting dualism entirely. But Roseman and others argue against that simple picture. They point to evidence suggesting Descartes didn't fully abandon the form matter way of thinking when it came to the human being.
Okay, intriguing. What's the evidence for this form matter interpretation?
Well, one point is why Descartes rejected substantial forms for physics. It was mainly because they smuggled in final causes purposes which he wanted out of physics. But that critique doesn't necessarily mean the mind couldn't be the substantial form of the human body, organizing it without those problematic final causes.
So the mind could still be a form in the Aristotelian sense, just not one with inherent goals for physics?
Kind of. And the source notes Descartes even occasionally called the soul a substantial form in letters. Another piece is how the body gets organized. The scholastics had this idea of a form of corporeity organizing matter, so it's ready for a soul.
Okay.
Roseman argues Descartes' idea of the body's configuration and movement of parts plays a similar role. It's the specific physical arrangement achieved mechanistically that makes the body apt for union with the soul, creating the disposition for it.
Ah, so the body's structure makes it ready for the soul, rather than a form pulling it together purposefully.
Exactly. And crucially, Descartes sometimes referred to mind and body not as two complete things, but as incomplete substances, that together form one complete substance, a single being in itself, and ens per se, using the Latin term.
Incomplete substances.
Yeah, like the soul and body are metaphysically incomplete on their own, only forming a complete human being when united. This sounds very much like the scholastic view.
So the union isn't just two things glued together, it's more fundamental. They make up one unified being.
That's the interpretation. And if that's right, then voluntary actions and sensations aren't mind acting on body or vice versa. They are modes or properties of the single unified human being.
Wow, okay.
Our source points to a letter to Elizabeth where Descartes talks about primitive notions, basic concepts. There's extension for body, thinking for mind, but also a distinct primitive notion of the union itself.
A fundamental concept of union.
Yes, and he says our understanding of how the mind moves the body and how the body affects the mind, sensations, passions, comes directly from this notion of union. These aren't interactions between two separate things, but modes of the composite being.
That completely reframes the problem. If lifting my hand is an act of the unified me, mind and body, the question of how a non-physical thing makes contact with a physical thing becomes, well, maybe the wrong question to ask.
Exactly. The need for physical contact causality might be bypassed if it's about the unified substance expressing its nature. The mind, as the thinking aspect, the act, actualizes the potential in the properly configured body, potency, to form the complete human, who then has these integrated experiences.
That's a much more integrated picture of Descartes than usually presented. A fascinating solution. But this source does mention a remaining snag. Formal causality.
Right. Even if we accept this form-matter interpretation, the deep question of how an immaterial form, the soul mind, exerts its organizing influence on material potential, the body, what's called formal causality, still remains a bit mysterious.
So how does the non-physical pattern actually shape the physical stuff?
Yeah. Our source notes, even within scholasticism, that specific link wasn't always fully explained. Descartes himself seemed to suggest maybe we don't need to fully grasp the how at that fundamental level. It's just how act and potency relate. So it offers way around mechanical interaction, but maybe doesn't dissolve all the causal mystery.
Okay, let's try and wrap this up for everyone listening. We started with that basic puzzle. Thoughts moving bodies.
Yeah.
This led us to Descartes' big idea. Mind-body dualism. Mind thinks, isn't extended. Body's extended, doesn't think.
Driven by his goals for religion and science.
Right. Then we looked at his arguments for the split clear and distinct ideas and the divisibility argument, which landed us squarely in the mind-body problem. How do these opposites interact?
The big challenge from Gassendi and Elizabeth.
Exactly. And finally, we explored Descartes' complex answer, leaning towards this idea of a substantial union, almost like a form-matter relationship where mind and body aren't just interacting but form a single, unified human being.
Shifting the problem from mechanical pushes to modes of a unified substance.
Yeah. And that key takeaway is pretty surprising, isn't it? That for Descartes, when you feel like lifting your hand, it's not just a thought poking your arm. It's an integrated action of the mind-body composite.
It's a much more holistic picture than the simple ghost in the machine idea often associated with him.
Absolutely. So for you listening, wrestling with this historical debate isn't just academic. It really does provide a foundation for understanding today's arguments in philosophy, psychology, neuroscience about consciousness, embodiment, what reality even is. It shows the complexity behind simple experiences.
Definitely. And it leaves us with the final thought to chew on. If our actions and sensations truly are products of this deep union, what does that really imply about where you begin and end? Are you just a mind piloting a body? Or is the self something fundamentally integrated, a blend of mental and physical that maybe can't be neatly separated? Think about what that means for how you experience, well, everything.
That's a fantastic question to ponder. We've obviously just scratched the surface here today. This is such a rich area.
Absolutely.
If this deep dive sparked your interest, definitely check out Descartes' own writings, like the Meditations and the ongoing philosophical work tackling this mind-body puzzle. It's a conversation centuries old, but still incredibly relevant.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.